Peak human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
Peak 人間
Hello, hello. What a beautiful day it is to be alive and well. I hope everyone is getting outside and getting some sun each day if they live someplace where that is possible. If not, at least getting outdoors and getting some exercise will have a ton of other benefits. Today's podcast is all about vitamin D and how it relates to human health and the immune system. Living a healthy lifestyle, avoiding metabolic disease, eating nutrient-dense animal foods, and getting responsible sunlight all play into your vitamin D status. Even some supplementation can be sometimes very necessary and beneficial. I posted another great study out of Indonesia on the correlations between vitamin D status and deaths from COVID-19. They are very striking, and everyone should check them out on social media on my Food Lies accounts. Just search for Food Lies on any platform. I've been talking to Joel about this vitamin D stuff for about a year now and have been tracking it over the past 6 weeks during the coronavirus pandemic. We've been trading information, and it was good to see that some good data has finally been coming out. I kept mentioning getting outside and getting sun exposure, but didn't want to post anything definitive until the science was clear. I think we're getting to that point now with multiple studies from multiple countries. Even Dr. Gary has been reporting extremely low levels in all his patients who are having bad cases of COVID. I'd also like to point out that the logo for my company, Sapien, is a sun. I couldn't think of a better representation of everything that represents healthy humans. Dr. Joel Gould is a dentist with 30 years of experience in Canada and the United States. He is on the forefront of revolutionizing modern dental approaches by furthering his knowledge on science, technology, and the human body. He has been featured for his innovative work on network TV such as Fox, NBC, ABC, and CBS. He launched his unique sleep restoration program in 2016, focusing on organic, non-pharmaceutical solutions for insomnia and sleep apnea. Dr. Gould's new book, The Modern Epidemic, set to be released this summer, lays out a new health paradigm based on sleep and breathing and natural regeneration founded on ancestral health and evolution. Before we jump in, I want to make sure everyone knows about nosetotail.org, where we ship 100% grass-finished beef and buffalo and high omega-3 pork and chicken to your door. This is all raised beyond organic in Texas. Our primal ground beef with liver, heart, kidney, and spleen is flying out the door these days. Get it while you can. We only process animals every 2 weeks. There are so many nutrients in this tasty ground beef that are hard to get otherwise. You can make a custom box at nosetotail.org and get free shipping if it's over 20 pounds. You can also support this podcast and everything else I do at patreon.com/peakhuman. I've been able to scrape by without taking on any advertisers or outside money for any of my ventures so far, and really want to keep it that way. The Food Lies film, the Food Lies YouTube channel, and all my social media is powered by the community. I have yet to take a cent from another company. That's patreon.com/peakhuman, or click through sapien.org, where you can find out about all the projects I'm working on, including the health technology. We're still looking for doctors, healthcare providers, and health coaches to work with us. You can add yourself to the waiting list at sapien.org. Thanks for sharing this podcast and reviewing it on iTunes and the Apple Podcast app. Really appreciate all of you and all the inspiring messages of positive health journeys. Now let's hear some great information about vitamin D from Dr. Joel Gould. All right, Dr. Joel Gould, we finally are doing this.
Hey, great to be here.
Yeah, well, we've been talking for about a year now, and you're in the area. You're a dentist by trade. Maybe you can introduce yourself a little more.
Sure. So my name is Dr. Joel Gould, and I'm a Canadian dentist. And I've been practicing in Los Angeles for the last 20 years. I became interested in something called sleep apnea about 5 years ago after I found out that I had it, which led me down a strange road to something called vitamin D. And I guess that's what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, but I want to make sure everyone knows how important this is. This topic is super related to this COVID pandemic. And I've been talking about vitamin D in every podcast, and I haven't gone into detail, but I've been saying, hey, get out in the sun. This is what I'm doing every day. I'm getting in the sun. I talked about it with Dr. Gary, who you are friends with as well. And we've been talking about vitamin D for a year now. So this stuff is super important and very relevant. And well, I like to do podcasts related to the current condition, COVID, but I also want to know this podcast can stand on its own as a super informative deep dive into vitamin D. And we're going to go deep, and there's going to be tons of info.
Great. Yeah, that sounds great. So it's really important. I've been working on this for 5 years, and the amount of information that I sort of accumulated is massive, and it's a very confusing subject. So the most important thing I want people to know is the one thing that they can pay attention to right now, in addition to the other things of washing your hands and taking vitamin C, is vitamin D. And there's a lot of misinformation around it. So I really want to clarify a lot of the details. I've been speaking about this with my patients for a long time, and even one-on-one, this can be confusing. So I don't want anyone to be too worried about this. We'll post everything that's relevant. There's a lot of numbers in that, but I want to give everybody a real understanding that this is a much more important topic than people are thinking, primarily because vitamin D isn't a vitamin. People think of vitamin C and vitamin D and different, vitamins, that they're all about the same. But vitamin D was mislabeled as a vitamin because it was discovered at the same time most of the vitamins were being discovered. And most people know that vitamin C is important, and they think that, sure, vitamin D is important as well. But it's a very different type of topic. And there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of confusion, especially even with people's physicians, because medical doctors don't learn about vitamin D, what it does, the big picture. They learn about it, how it relates to bone, but they don't really cover a lot of what it does with the immune system, which is what brings us to this topic today. So vitamin C is a vitamin, and it's a water-soluble vitamin. And what that means is that you have it in your body and it doesn't build up slowly over time. Vitamin D is a fat-soluble hormone. And what that means is that it takes a long time to build up in your body. You don't use it up every day. And vitamin D technically is a hormone that we make on our skin from sunlight. So the discussion when it comes to especially our immune system is vitamin C is a great antioxidant. It's very important to have. It's a cofactor, which means that it helps activate specific enzymes. And enzymes are like the worker bees of your cell. They're the things that make different reactions. So vitamin C is really critical, but vitamin D regulates the actual production of enzymes. So it's a completely different level of importance. It's like a quantum leap. Vitamin C, you should take it daily. Vitamin D needs to build up in your system. And this is where the confusion comes in.
Yeah, I love that, because there's a lot of people talking about vitamin C. It's like, oh yeah, you got to do this for COVID. And people are kind of labeling this as misinformation even, or maybe there's not good science to show that it is truly helpful. And we don't care about that. Yeah, vitamin C is a whole different ballgame. It is what it is. You can think what you will about it. But I like how you say vitamin D, orders of magnitude more important. It's a hormone, not a vitamin. And it's just a different discussion.
Right. And that's why it's important to sort of get into the details. And again, if any medical doctors are listening to this who are not functional medicine doctors, this is information. It's not presented. It wasn't presented to me in dental school 30 years ago. It's not taught today. And traditional medicine doesn't pay attention to this. Most of the curriculum is focused on pharmaceutical medications. And vitamin D, why it's so important is that this particular hormone is tied into almost every function in your body. It's very complex, and it's confusing even to doctors. There's dosing issues. There's different levels in Canada. It's a different reading than it is in the US. And so to be able to understand this and to be able to really empower yourself with information, you really have to understand this. There isn't really one place that you can go to get a clear idea of what is vitamin D, why is it important? And, this doesn't just relate to COVID-19. This is something that is a huge regulator of the immune system itself. And this is what can also protect you from things like cancer. So on the short term, you really want to get your vitamin D level up into what I call an evolutionary range, one that will protect you from not just COVID-19, but every virus. Vitamin D is antibacterial, it's antifungal. And, the understanding of why we don't know about this is kind of scandalous, to be honest with you. But I want to go into those details, and I want people to understand that you have to learn just a little bit of science. Vitamin D regulates our gut microbiome. And I know that a lot of people are taking probiotics, and we're hearing so much about these gut bacteria. But this is the fascinating part. This one thing regulates so much in your body because what it does is it regulates your own access to your DNA. So everyone has a set of genes that they inherited, and everyone's talking about genetics, but there's a completely different science called epigenetics. And that's the science of how we actually turn our genes off and on. And vitamin D is one of the most powerful epigenetic moderators in existence. This is a hormone that ties us to season and location on this planet. So it's really profound. And all animals use vitamin D. And there's even plant vitamin D, which is vitamin D2, a vitamin D that's often given as a prescription by medical doctors who don't know the difference between vitamin D2 and D3.
It's kind of like the difference between K1 and K2 and retinol and vitamin A.
Absolutely. It's a very similar discussion. The biggest issue that we have is that doctors get very little training about vitamins, and they're usually sort of discredited. Vitamins are for dietitians, and certain people who focus on vitamins are called quacks because there's a lack of knowledge that these are the most important chemicals in our body. These are the chemicals that Mother Nature created us with. So they're much more important than people are thinking. I had a patient ask me once, I heard that vitamins they don't work. It's a waste of time. And, that's a really scary conversation because vitamins are very important, but there isn't really a great resource where you can go to and learn about vitamins in a meaningful way.
And I think that part of the problem is people think it's a waste of time because many multivitamins are a waste of time because they're not in a bioavailable form. People aren't eating them with fat, and you need fat-soluble vitamins to be, soluble with fat. And there is a whole bunch of stuff out there. And I was skeptical of vitamins too, right? I always thought, oh, this is a waste of money. People say, oh, it's expensive urine or something,
Right.
So
Right.
We're going to get into it. But before we even get into it, I want to talk about this study. The grassroots health study. I'm glad that people have been posting it around. I've seen it a little bit on social media in the past couple of days. And it's really important showing the different levels of vitamin D and the severity of cases of COVID.
Right. Yeah. So this is one of the first studies that's come out. Most of the people who know about vitamin D have assumed that this is what would happen. And this is exactly what we assume. When vitamin D levels are low, the lower the D level, the sicker the person. And, you can see this in different studies, even when it comes to cancer. It's fairly obvious. So this particular study was really great because they gave you a vitamin D level, and they basically told you, people who were below 20 were very deficient. And it really correlated with the COVID cases.
So they only did it between below 20 is deficient, 21 to 29 it was mid-range, and then above 30 was normal. So there's a whole new discussion. We should be well above 30, but this is just the 3 categories they put people into.
That's right. Yeah.
I want to post this. This is really important. I'll post this on social media, but for people listening to see this visually, because they took these 3 levels. Red was below 20, yellow between 20 and 29, green above 30. And then they broke up the COVID severity cases by critical, which were basically all of red and yellow, severe, basically all red and yellow, ordinary, basically all red and yellow with, little of the green, and then mild, all green, 96 green and 2 yellow and red.
It brings up right away about vitamin D levels. How do you know what those numbers mean? Okay. And it's confusing because in the US, we're going by nanograms per milliliter, but in Canada and in Europe, it's nanomoles. And the difference between the two is that you have to multiply the nanograms by 2.5. So for anyone who's listening to this in other countries, we're going to be speaking about nanograms per milliliter, and it's confusing. So these numbers are a measure of your blood level. And this is a particular form of vitamin D. This is the storage form that you have in your body. And you can recognize this by looking at a lab test. This is your 25 OHD level. And that is the form that we store. And that's the form that can be measured in a test. There's also a 125 OHD level, and that's an active form. So they can be very confusing, and doctors will often test the wrong one. So the numbers that when it comes to COVID here, these are some of the levels. So depending on who you talk to, different societies have different ideas of what's deficient. It becomes very confusing to people who aren't paying attention to this. But what I want people to know is that if your doctor hasn't tested your vitamin D level and you haven't been suntanning and you don't take any higher dose of vitamin D, and when I say that, I mean anything over 1 or 2,000 IU, that you're going to be deficient, especially if you live in the Northern Hemisphere. So these numbers, they're not a surprise to me, but they're quite low. And basically, I want all my patients to be well up over 40, 42, and I say actually never go below 50. And that's an evolutionary level. That's the amount that if you were to be living outside and getting sun exposure with most of your body exposed would be normal. So these levels are completely incidental or accidental. These levels exist because people wear clothing, they wear sunscreen, which blocks all vitamin D production, and they stay out of the sun between 10 and 3, as their doctors usually suggest. So knowing that these levels, this is critical to health here, that you want to know your level. And there are lots of places where you can order a test online if you're worried that you don't know your level.
Mm-hmm. And this is great because this audience is very in tune with ancestral health. They're not going to need to be sold on us trying to live back like our ancestors. And also, I want to throw in that Dr. Gary has tested all his patients, and it's almost across the board. They're in their 20s and 30s. And especially just recently, the people coming in for COVID, very, very low. They're in their 20s. He hasn't seen people with a good vitamin D level that have come in for these COVID cases.
Well, we're on lockdown. It's, week 5 or 6. And I want you to understand that for most people, the only time they really get vitamin D is walking from their house to their car or from their car into the office. And now everyone's in lockdown and they're not even getting just that casual sun exposure. So people's levels are plummeting. And I want to give some people a real life explanation of how you can know if your D level is low. Because as a dentist, I've been going into the office for emergency calls. 50% of my patients are having issues with something called bruxism. Bruxism is clenching and grinding. If you clench and grind your teeth, either daytime or nighttime, you are vitamin D deficient. And if you're grinding during the day, you're probably quite severely deficient. The other major symptoms are insomnia, anxiety, IBS. There's a lot going on right now that you may think that, you're just nervous, you can't fall asleep, but vitamin D is required in a specific quantity to allow you to be able to sleep. So for anyone out there who's been clenching and grinding their teeth or has started to, under lockdown, this is the root cause.
Yeah. And also want to point out, you're more than just a dentist, you're a sleep expert.
That's right. Sleep apnea, people have heard of this before, and most people don't even know about this disease. It's a disease that everyone thinks they don't have, but most people do. And it's usually blamed on obesity. And I have a 23-year-old patient who came in about 3-4 months ago, and she had terrible sleep apnea. She was petite and she's young, nothing wrong with her airway. And we finally tested her vitamin D level. It was at 7. And that's not that uncommon. Yeah, I'm seeing that a lot. So vitamin D deficiency will severely interrupt your sleep. And so, especially if you have children, if your child grinds their teeth or snores or even sucks their thumb, these are all profound and severe vitamin D deficiencies. And this is really serious. Everyone kind of jokes about snoring, but snoring is actually a neurological sign that there's something wrong.
Are there different reasons for snoring though? I mean, is it like 90% this and then 10% something else, or how does that work?
Right. Well, this is a part of the confusion. So if you snore, it doesn't mean you have sleep apnea. And if you don't snore, it doesn't mean that you don't have sleep apnea. So snoring is simply the noise that your soft palate makes when it vibrates. Now, if you can't breathe through your nose or you don't have great nasal breathing, you may snore more because there's more pressure being put as the air flows past your palate. But the key feature here is that it's the actual lack of vitamin D and lack of proper neurotransmitters that allow for snoring to happen. Some people have the type of airway where the shape just doesn't lend to snoring and they just don't ever snore. I have sleep apnea and I don't snore. So it's quite confusing. But so snoring itself is not a sign that you have sleep apnea, but it can be. Snoring is just a relaxation of the airway. And, I've got patients who have massively wide airways who don't snore and tiny airways who do snore. So there's all kinds of variety. This is not really a structural disease. This is a neurological, neurogenic muscle control disease. Yeah. And so how I got into this was, I was diagnosed with sleep apnea and I'm not obese. I started to travel around the country to figure out, what can I do about this disease? Most people are terrified of finding out if they have sleep apnea because they think about that gas mask, the CPAP, and nobody wants to wear that. So I got into this because I'm a dentist and you can wear something called a mandibular advancement device. This is an oral appliance that you put in your mouth and it holds your airway open. It can eliminate snoring immediately and really help you sleep better. So a lot of people, when they find out that they have these issues, whether they snore or do have apnea or even insomnia, because a lot of insomnia is undiagnosed sleep apnea, wearing an oral device is really kind of acceptable because a lot of these people are also clenching and grinding their teeth, and many of them are already wearing grinding guards. So it's quite common. And this is just a completely different way of treating the disease. Most doctors out there believe that sleep apnea is an irreversible chronic degenerative disease. And I believe that it's completely preventable and even reversible. So it's something really different to think about. But the most important thing people need to understand is this is a syndrome that you will not know that you have until it's been there for a long time. So what happens is, literally, you'll be choking in your sleep without knowing it. And sometimes you won't be able to sleep. Sometimes you'll sleep right through it. And, I've seen thousands of sleep studies, and it's quite amazing that people really don't know what's happening in their sleep.
Yeah. And we could do a whole podcast on the sleep apnea part. So we should put that aside for a second, but just know that it's related to this, and it's really interesting. But let's steer back to this study, the grassroots health study, and just about, why it affects your immune system and that kind of thing.
Right. So the basic understanding is that the most important thing it does related to COVID-19 is it allows you to upregulate the gene that makes antimicrobial proteins. And they're called cathepsidins. And so we make over 200 of these antimicrobial proteins, but we only make them when we have a specific amount of vitamin D in our bodies. And the reason is that vitamin D is required to open your DNA for copying so that you can make those critical proteins. And now, once we understand that whole process, this is the most important thing, because vitamin D acts the same way no matter what it does. People think that vitamin D, if it's for bones, it helps you absorb calcium. And how does it help you absorb calcium? It does it in exactly the same way. Vitamin D goes to your DNA and allows you to copy the specific genes that allow you to make calcium ion transporters, that you can bring more calcium into your cells. It also allows you to make more of the enzymes that carry calcium and bring it into your blood. And so understanding that when you have the right level of vitamin D, your body finally has the energy to be able to copy the genes that it wants. So when it comes to these antimicrobial proteins, and we're talking about the cytokine storm, vitamin D creates these proteins that literally destroy the virus. This is your best defense. And this is how we were designed. So where this comes into play in the bigger picture is that those same cathepsidins, or antimicrobial proteins, they're expressed by your skin and also by your digestive system. And in the digestive system, they regulate the type of bacteria that you maintain. The human microbiome, it's massive. It's the same weight or the bacteria in your body is the same weight as your brain. This is an organ that keeps you healthy. And when you don't have the right microbiome, you can't produce a lot of the natural chemicals that we would have normally. Your immune system is very weak. And that's because your gut bacteria, they're the wrong kind. They're the kind that you would normally have in winter. And so it's a completely different type of species that are going to be hanging around there. A lot of people, taking probiotics, you can't keep the right gut bacteria if you don't have the right vitamin D level. And, those cathepsidin production, that's one of the most powerful ways. So when those D levels are low, the immune system itself, and there's one more aspect, and again, I don't want to be too confusing here, but if your D level is low, you don't sleep properly. And sleep really is the great leveler. If you're not sleeping well, your immune system isn't going to work. There's just thousands of studies showing that poor sleep and a terrible immune system are very, very well linked.
That's an easy one that everyone can get behind.
Sure.
Everyone knows how important sleep is. And also just in general immune system. I mean, when I started raising my vitamin D, I think it's one of the big factors of why I haven't been sick in like 4 years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When I raised my vitamin D level, I was kind of shocked because I would get a cold or a flu and I'd have a sore throat for 3 or 4 days and then, blow my nose for a week and a half, 2 weeks. Then I'd get a chest infection after. Since I raised my vitamin D level from 18 to about 80, I really haven't been sick barely even one time in 5 years. And it's kind of shocking.
Absolutely. And also, maybe this is the time to throw in the great YouTube video presentation by Ivor Cummins that I've mentioned at least once, called D is for Debacle. And that's, you watched that years ago and got really into this. I watched it a year ago and when I started getting really into this. So everyone should watch that. It's amazing. And everyone should know that Ivor Cummins is awesome. He's been on the podcast. He has a great podcast of his own.
Well, when you find out about this, I didn't really believe it. I just assumed, like everyone, I take a multivitamin. There's a vitamin D in there. There's 600 IU, or international units. And that's the RDA. That's the recommended daily allowance of vitamin D. So I didn't doubt for a second. I wasn't worried about it. And I thought I drink juice and milk and I thought I was just fine. But when I saw that video, it's called D for Debacle, it kind of blew my mind. And there's a lot of technical stuff on it, but for me, as a healthcare provider with 25 years experience, to see that video, it really shocked me.
It's amazing. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, so the other thing is that the reason I got into this so much was that when I raised my vitamin D level, my autoimmune disease went away. So for anyone out there who has autoimmune disease, I have Crohn's disease, or I should say I had Crohn's disease. And when I raised my vitamin D level from 18 to 80, my Crohn's disease that I had suffered with for 34 years disappeared. And then I went online as a scientist and a researcher, and I was really shocked to find several peer-reviewed studies where they took a small group of people and they raised their vitamin D level, and they'd have 80 or 90% of the people had complete resolution of their symptoms. So I'm not really happy about this. And that's kind of why I became such a big crusader, is that, anyone who's suffering from any autoimmune disease, if you don't know and track your vitamin D level and keep it up over 60, you need to do some research. This is not right. The medical industry, they don't learn about this. And I was really disappointed that I hadn't heard this before. So this is much more critical than anyone's thinking. And the other reason is that Crohn's disease can turn to cancer. Inflammatory bowel disease is very well linked with bowel cancer. And so vitamin D deficiency is also linked with cancer. And I want everyone to know that the way this works is that vitamin D deficiency doesn't cause cancer, is that it allows cancer to grow. Vitamin D regulates your anti-cancer system. And when your D level is low, your body does not have enough energy to do all the things that it wants to do to be able to prevent cancer from growing. So this is really important.
And I want to point out too, there's tons of randomized controlled trials, like real science out there that this proves all of this. This is not just him talking, right? Like in the beginning of the D is for debacle video, Ivor shows some of these. He goes through a lot of them. We can link to a lot of these. It's there's correlations, very well correlated. There's epidemiology, there's randomized controlled trials. There's all kinds of studies showing all of this stuff. So know that. And then also I want to say the hand in hand of vitamin D and the diet, that you change your diet as well. And so they work together. So it's not that you just did nothing different and resolved Crohn's disease through vitamin D, but that they're intertwined, but you change the way you eat. And we could take a little sidetrack to talk about the way you eat now.
Right. Well, yeah, absolutely. So the ketogenic diet or a sapiens diet is absolutely the way to go. And it goes back to ancestral health. We didn't have processed carbohydrates through 99.9% of our evolutionary history. These aren't foods that humans evolved to eat. I changed a lot, and it was a kind of a journey to get into it all. But, the way our bodies work is very different than what doctors are thinking. And the food that you eat is so much more important. And, eating a ketogenic diet or eating a high-fat, grass-fed organic diet will upregulate specific genes in your body. And those are the genes that will also keep you healthy.
Exactly. And so, you don't necessarily need to be keto all the time. But like you said, it's a sapien diet. It's just the general term for an ancestral diet, whole foods. This is what you switched to. You stopped eating refined carbs. You started eating more animal foods, nose to tail, grass-fed, all that stuff.
Yeah. What's interesting too is that when people switch to a ketogenic diet, their vitamin D level will often come up. And that's a whole different discussion of why. But it's very common when people switch to, having a more natural diet, their vitamin D levels will increase.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So we did the diet sidetrack. That's all great. We're all on the same page there. I guess we can just go through the whole vitamin D presentation. I mean, you have this whole thing. I love it. We can kind of go through it all and then come back around to some things later.
Cool. Okay. What is vitamin D? And, where are we supposed to get it? Most people think that if they eat a healthy diet, they're going to get enough vitamin D. And it's just simply impossible. There's so little vitamin D in food unless you're eating whale blubber and organ meats, and a lot of them. And so vitamin D always came from sunlight, and it comes from a specific range of sunlight. There's UVA and UVB radiation. Vitamin D is made by UVB radiation, which is a weak type of radiation that's only made at certain times of the day. And sunlight itself is 95% UVA radiation and 5% UVB radiation. And what's the difference? Vitamin D is one of the components of UVB radiation, but UVB radiation does three things. It produces vitamin D, it produces melanin, which is your body's anti-sun sunscreen, and it also produces a sunburn, which is critical because once you've been in the sun long enough, your skin lets you know that you need to seek shade. And so it brings to light the idea, if you're wearing sunscreen, that you're going to block all of your UVB radiation and not necessarily all of your UVA radiation. Now, UVA radiation penetrates deeper, and it's what causes a lot of the sun damage as well. It's what breaks down collagen and causes photoaging. So sunlight is a combination of UVA and UVB, and you won't make the UVB radiation except for specific times a day. And we'll go through what those times are and what you can look for. But the easy way to think about it is if you're outside and your shadow is shorter than your height, you are making vitamin D. If your shadow is longer than your height, it's already too late in the day or too early in the day, and the sun isn't high enough in the sky to be strong enough to produce vitamin D on your skin. Okay?
That's good. And then in a normal place like in LA, isn't it something just around midday? I looked it up. Actually, the peak is 1 p.m. right now. And it's like,
right. So solar noon. And it varies in your time zone. And, there is an app called D-Minder, and it's a great app. I've spoken with the creator of that, and it's really helpful because, in the old days when you could travel, wherever you go, you could change the location. You could figure out when you would be able to get vitamin D, and it allows you to track how much you make, and it tells you literally, when you're making vitamin D. So I think it's really informative. And for everyone in the Northern Hemisphere, there literally is a line that it goes between Los Angeles and Atlanta. And for most of the winter, at least 4 months or more, there isn't any vitamin D available to be made. It's just not possible. The sun doesn't get up high enough in the sky to create vitamin D. So people who live in the Northern Hemisphere, they really do have to supplement. And, I'm in Los Angeles. It's sunny here every day. And so many of my patients are still vitamin D deficient. People are really afraid of the sun. So
there's two sides to that too. There's people who protect themselves way too much from the sun, which is a huge thing we'll get into, and wearing too much sunscreen and they never get enough. But then we're also not saying go on the sun forever, right? There's always this talk of responsible sunlight, and it's super important to let people know that's obvious. We're not saying go get burned. And you already said that,
Most important thing is that for anyone listening to this, do not run out and just expose yourself. When I started talking about this to my patients, I had a couple of people who came in and they said, I got so burnt. I want people to understand that sun safety is very confusing. Spraying yourself with sunscreen and going outside all day is not what people think. This is a completely different issue. So because humans are literally solar-powered animals, understanding more about what vitamin D is, what dose to take, and how to expose yourself safely outside is really critical. This is going to become more and more visible because we've been told really the wrong story. My dermatologist, they said, do not go in the sun at all. Stay out of the sun at all costs. And, that's bad information, but it's also not good just to go out and just blast yourself with sun. Humans have very definitive techniques that we utilize sunlight with, but we can block it as well. And I kind of like to say the sun doesn't cause cancer. Inappropriate sun exposure can cause cancer. And, if you were a hunter-gatherer living out in the wild, eating natural foods, and, right from the beginning of the season, you get a nice deep dark tan, it'd be completely safe to spend all your time outside. We live indoors. You think you get a lot of sunlight. You're at work all week, and then on the weekend, you go out for a couple of hours. And this is a big problem. So people need to understand that taking in sunlight is very important, and vitamin D supplements are great, but it's much better to do at a minimum a combination. Just taking vitamin D supplements has its own problems. You do want to get some sun exposure. It's really important, and you need to know how to expose yourself safely. And first of all, I want to say there's never any need to expose your face when you're trying to get vitamin D. We get enough sunlight on our faces. You can wear a big hat. You can cover your face all kinds of different ways, but no need to lie out in the sun and expose your face. It's just not important.
Absolutely. I always put a shirt over my face. And also my face is sensitive, but yeah, keep going.
Yeah. Okay, so back to vitamin D. So how is vitamin D made? Well, what is it? So vitamin D is actually a variation of cholesterol. It's made from cholesterol that's in your skin. And most people, your audience is already aware that cholesterol is not a villain. I think cholesterol is a hero. It's what holds your body together. Cholesterol is what we required to change from plants into animals. And cholesterol is your strongest structural component of your body. So when a version of cholesterol called 7-dehydroxycholesterol is struck by UV rays from the sun in the range of 280 to 315 on the electromagnetic spectrum, that energy can break one chemical bond, and technically it's on the B ring, the B ring of carbon, and it now changes that molecule completely. And this isn't that unusual because our bodies use cholesterol for almost everything that we want to produce. We use it to make testosterone and estrogen. This is the precursor to a lot of different chemicals. And so, of course, it makes sense that vitamin D would be made from cholesterol. What's really unique about vitamin D is that cholesterol as a molecule is rigid, it's flat. When you break that one bond, you change the vibrational energy of that entire molecule, because you can sort of think of it like a hula hoop. If you have it in your hands and it's rigid and you cut it, it feels so weird. It's got a strange sensation to it. And that's what vitamin D is. Vitamin D can now, instead of being a plain flat molecule, can rotate, and it changes really profoundly the function of the molecule. And I used to call vitamin D a universal Allen key, because this little chemical is really a messenger molecule. It's very different than people think. This does very different things in different tissues. And so we'll get into sort of how that all works, but vitamin D doesn't work on its own. Vitamin D works with other cofactors. And basically, that's why it's so confusing. It doesn't do just one thing. It does different things in different tissues with different cofactors for different reasons.
And real quick, sorry, if anyone still think vitamin D is just a vitamin, you have to look at it visually. The molecule, it is identical to cholesterol. It's just the one difference, yeah.
That's it. This is one chemical bond difference, which is really fascinating. So vitamin D deficiency started quite a long time ago. People, it's been around for a long time, but what's the big deal? Why is it such a serious thing? It's linked to everything. And so we went through some of that stuff, but, people need to know that, I've got some stats here on the slides. 92% of Hashimoto's patients had vitamin D deficiency. And if you have Hashimoto's and you don't know and monitor your D level, you definitely want to investigate. Even fertility and pregnancy. So vitamin D is a hormone made on your skin from sunlight, and this is an indication of season to your body. Animals follow the seasonal cycle of reproduction. Humans don't, but that hormone is still really critical for fertility. So if you've had issues with fertility or even having difficulties carrying a child to term, and you're not tracking your vitamin D level and you're not maintaining a D level up over 50, you need to either find a new doctor or do some research, because this information is plainly available and it's really important. So a lot of fertility doctors don't even monitor D levels, which is really confusing. So
that's huge. Sorry, I keep jumping in here, but we didn't mention Weston A. Price yet, and I mention it every episode, so here it is. Okay. But also, Dr. Joel is sort of the reincarnation of Weston Price. He's a Canadian dentist, and he's kind of made his life mission to kind of carry on Weston Price's work. And Weston Price did find all of this out, almost 100 years ago, traveling the world and looking at pregnancies and carrying child to term and vitamin D, and he kind of discovered a lot of this stuff already.
The best part about Weston Price is this is at a time before antibiotics existed. This is a time before we knew what DNA was. He discovered all this by simple observation alone, which is incredible. And he photographed his work. So he's still not taught today in dental school. And Weston Price, basically, his discovery was there was two nutritional components that turned out to be vitamin D3 and vitamin K2 that were critical in the overall health of humans in general. And the reason is that vitamin D is a profound regulator of the immune system itself. And vitamin K2 is really critical for managing your calcium. So a lot of doctors will be giving vitamin D and calcium supplements. Do not take calcium and vitamin D. Too much calcium can lower your phosphorus level. So vitamin D was always designed to be taken with vitamin K2. When I say take it, it means it came with it. Vitamin K2 comes from the green grass of summer. So when your D level is high, you're absorbing a lot of calcium. At that time, the grass is green and vitamin K2 is present in our diets. And that allows you to
by eating animals that eat the grass.
Correct. Well, the question is whether humans actually made vitamin K2 with a different gut microbiome. But we used to get it. My feeling is that we may have lost our ability to make K2 when we domesticated animals. But we get the vitamin K2 from the milk and meat of animals that eat green growing grass. The greener the grass, the more the K2. And you can get a little bit in some hard cheeses, and definitely you can get a lot more in unpasteurized milk products, which are hard to get. And then obviously, we've probably all heard of natto, which is a Japanese food. It's a little bit slimy, but it's got a lot of K2. Mm-hmm. So those two are really critical to take together. You could never get vitamin D in nature without vitamin K2. Vitamin D should never be taken without vitamin K2. That's what makes it dangerous. Doctors are terrified that if you take too much vitamin D, every part of your body is going to get calcified. And so they're worried about that, but they don't know about vitamin K2. So there's no fear of calcification of your body if you are maintaining some vitamin K2 on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. And that's what our ancestors did. And yeah, either naturally or by the foods they ate.
Yeah, absolutely. This was just the normal way of life. This is how we're designed. The life that we're living today, we're living, indoors and everything. This is not how our bodies evolved to live. We're literally, this is like a cage to us. So we're really caged animals, and that animals in captivity get sick. So it's not a surprise that when we cut off these essential things that we had in abundance, that things break down. And Price's most important discovery, I think, was epigenetics. This was at a time when Adolf Hitler was euthanizing people in Nazi Germany. This was in the 1930s. And this guy, I think he was incredible because he said, hey guys, I think that this is the environment. And he's really one of the fathers of epigenetics. So he could tell just by observation that vitamin D and vitamin K2 are critical. And where it comes to really the most important thing is, as your immune system decreases, you start to get dental decay and gum disease. And both of those syndromes are bacterial infections. And the reason they grow is because if your immune system can't make those antimicrobial proteins, they can't stop decay in your mouth or gum disease, just like they can't stop a viral infection like COVID-19.
That's super interesting because people know that Weston Price traveled around and knew how connected the mouth health and the teeth health was to their overall health. And that's why.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Back in those days, everyone had their teeth extracted. I've been practicing long enough to have, seen a lot of that stuff. And what he was seeing was a destruction of our physical health and the health of the jaw and the airway. And the mouth is so critical because it's not just chewing and speaking. This is where you breathe through. And that's why I got into all the sleep apnea stuff. If your airway is, not formed properly, this really amplifies all the terrible health issues. Back in those days, this was at a time post-industrial revolution. They already knew about vitamin D and they were putting it into everything, but this information hasn't spread. No one really knows Weston Price's discoveries, except hopefully for your audience. So I hope that, is a little helpful. And what is it, when your vitamin D level is low, you don't breathe properly through your nose, you have colds and flus, you actually get an inflammation of the nasal passages and especially a swelling of the tonsils. So vitamin D is inversely proportional to tonsil size. If you have a child who has recurrent tonsil infections, this is because they've been chronically low on their vitamin D. And those tonsils swell up and they also occlude the airway. So kids start to choke in their sleep. So this is really a massive syndrome. Back in those days, there was a lot of illness. There was a lot of things that we don't see as much today. But he tied all this together and is absolutely correct because if you don't sleep properly, your child doesn't grow. If you don't get into the deep restorative stages of sleep, you can't heal and make up for all the damage from your daily wear and tear.
Yeah, that's great.
Vitamin D indicates season. It regulates so many different diseases. And, I'm going through my slides here. So we can talk about cancer. And there's a great slide that shows you at what vitamin D level people are protected from cancer. And when we get up into the breast cancer range, and those levels are 50 and higher, if 67% of breast cancer can be prevented by having a vitamin D level over 50, I can't imagine why doctors don't just jump on this and say, wait a second, this is something I'm not even testing. So this is really critical.
Well, describe this slide a little bit more.
Sure. Well, this is basically, it's titled The Estimated Proportion of Cancers Preventable by Serum 25-OHD Range. And so all cancers combined, the range is having a level of just about 40 to about 55. There's all different types of cancer. And these type of studies can also be confusing because vitamin D hasn't been well researched. And a lot of the studies that are out there were based on dosages, not blood levels. So it can be confusing. But the basic take-home message here is that almost all cancers can be reduced by having a higher vitamin D level.
What? And this is from a study that you took this, or
this is multiple studies? So Ivor Cummings has a lot of this data. He basically will go through at what levels you're protected. And where it comes down to is we talked about those enzymes. Once your vitamin D level gets up past 40, 42, 43, that's when your body has enough vitamin D to make the enzymes that it wants to. So, that's why I tell my patients, stay up over 50 because there's no need to be lower. You don't want to be putting yourself at risk for all these diseases that are related to low vitamin D. And just keep in mind that your D level is low because you're not managing it.
What about diabetes? So there's another slide here.
So, so diabetes as well. And, this is a cool slide because it's showing you something called a smile curve. And I kind of laugh and say it should be a frown curve because it shows you the incidence of diabetes based on latitude. And this is a slide, this is done quite a while ago. And, we have to be careful because past a certain point in human history, your latitude is not as relevant because of sun avoidance and the use of sunscreen. But primarily what we see is that the closer you live to the equator, the lower the incidence of every disease, including diabetes. And of course, this makes sense once you understand the profound nature of what vitamin D is.
It's huge. So just to describe it a little more, the smile means how close in the middle is the latitude of 0. You're at the equator. And as you go away from the equator, the more diabetes there are and the more disease in general on either side, right? So you go north or you go south, you go away from the equator, all of these diseases go up, and you have all the different countries on this slide, and you can see.
And it's really critical because it's not just vitamin D, it's sunlight as well. So, the most important thing is that the vitamin D is really critical, but sun exposure is a part of this. People who live in sunnier climates are generally healthier.
Yeah, in Hawaii right now, there's very few cases of COVID, actually.
Yeah. I would expect that a lot. But it depends on each individual person. A lot of people who live in these warmer climates, there's a lot of diabetes in Africa. And the issue is that when people get air conditioning and move indoors, that's when they get sick. It's when you live outside and you're exposed to the sun all the time that keeps you healthy. There are other things that sunlight does for our bodies, which are, aside from vitamin D, we can talk about cholesterol sulfate, we can talk about nitric oxide, but the main component here, vitamin D, if we stick to that, it's less confusing, but sunlight itself is very healthy. In this space, in the biohacking world, the understanding of, people are doing red light therapy and infrared saunas and cryotherapy. This stuff is related. Okay. So this is all related together about general and overall health. And being in the sun does a lot of the things that biohacking does for us.
Side a little detour here about the flu season. So, or just people were talking about, I've seen news stories of like, the warm weather, it's the warm weather, the virus can't live in the warm weather. And I don't think it's the warm weather. It's the sun, right? It's like that you have more vitamin D when the sun's out. It has nothing to do, to my knowledge, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that the actual temperature has nothing to do with the virus. It's that you get the vitamin D from the sun.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any studies that have linked temperature to this type of thing. But, the first thing that has gotten out is that sunlight itself is antiviral. So when sunlight hits the coronavirus or any virus, it's easily destroyed. And the other thing is that, obviously when it's cold out and you're staying indoors more, there's a greater chance for transmission, but you can track the flu. It's the same every year. It comes up in the fall and disappears in the spring. And that's because just from casually spending more time outside in the summer, you're going to raise your vitamin D level and your own immune system is going to be able to make those antimicrobial proteins to destroy this virus. And it's not just that it destroys it. You have to understand viral load and all these different things. Now, I've been, discussing this with some of my friends about, well, why do people get sicker? Well, they're exposed to more virus. I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. Basically, when a virus starts to replicate, if you have a high level of those antimicrobial proteins, you'll be decreasing your viral load. So that's where this all intersects. The higher your vitamin D level to a point, the more able your body is to defend against the virus replicating. So the sunlight itself raises your vitamin D, and then you're able to fight this off. So even if you get this flu, you may not even notice that you have it. And that's probably the unifying factor, is that people who don't even know they have it, if we tested them, their D level would probably be quite high. And that's what the great thing about that study was. This is the first, hopefully, of many where we're going to track people's vitamin D level to the severity of their infection. It should be pretty much a linear progression to a point. Once your vitamin D is sufficient, it should level off.
I believe in that. And and people are wondering, why do some people, get it and have no symptoms? And why do some people, they're outwardly healthy, but they have bad cases? It's probably vitamin D. And, we'll just call it now. Like, I think this is going to come to light and we're going to learn more about this as we track it. So hopefully the mainstream kind of figures this out. And one more quick thing, there's ways to safely social distance and still get sunlight, right? We're not saying go out and, go free for all. I'm not going to get involved in any of this, the politics of this, lockdown. I'm just going to say is I can go outside safely by myself, get vitamin D at around 1 p.m. and go back inside.
Right. Well, it's a bit tragic because I see people outside who've got hoodies on and masks on. They're covering themselves up like they think the coronavirus is going to come and attack them. And it's really a shame. So you can get lots of sun exposure. One of the interesting things that a study that I saw, or some information, was that all the doctors in Italy, they were North African, which, they had darker skin. So those doctors who died, I don't believe they were tracking their vitamin D level. This is just not known. And the darker your skin is, the more time you need to spend outside to make the same amount of vitamin D. And this is a very big topic going on right now, is African Americans and darker skinned people are having a much worse time fighting this virus. And this is where it comes together, is that sure, there's socioeconomic issues, but just plainly put, the darker the skin, the more time you need to be in the sun. And African Americans, they have lower vitamin D levels across the board. And I believe that's what the connection is.
And especially, so the doctors in Italy, or just many of these doctors who are getting it, they're spending all day in the hospital. They're not out there getting vitamin D.
Tragic part is a lot of these doctors, these younger doctors, they don't know about vitamin D either. I have been in this profession now for a long time. I'd never heard of this. And if you would have told me, honestly, 10 years ago, vitamin D, I don't even know whether I would have paid attention. I think that you have to really have a very real, I had a experience where I couldn't believe this. This was just unreal to me. So unless you feel this personally, you can be skeptical, and it's not unusual. And that's the scary part, is that medical doctors, they're kind, caring people, very intelligent. But if you're not taught this, how are you going to know? For me, just investigating this, I was kind of blown away. This is out there. It's clear. There's a lot of peer-reviewed studies, but it's just not known.
Yeah. And I was skeptical at first. I invite everyone to be skeptical. You don't have to take everything we're saying at face value, but look at it yourself and you'll come around.
Right. Yeah. So it brings me back to some of the more profound stuff. And, I've been looking at these studies for a while. When it comes to studies, if you're going to look at one study, you want to look at this particular one on the slideshow. It's titled Accelerated Aging. Okay. And I have a link to PubMed. And this sort of smart guy who, I don't know what his life experience was, but he put together all these different things that vitamin D is in control of. And for your audience, they're going to understand a lot of this. And so it controls autophagy, mitochondrial dysfunction, oxidative stress, inflammation, calcium signaling, epigenetics, and DNA disorders such as telomere shortening. And the way this is so linked into this is that for example, your telomeres, people listening to this know that your telomeres are the little clips at the end of your DNA. And when those wear out like a shoelace, you've replicated your DNA too many times. Vitamin D insufficiency allows you to create an enzyme called telomerase. And this enzyme will repair the telomeres. So just simply having a low vitamin D level doesn't allow you to copy and produce the enzyme that repairs your telomeres. And that's the profound nature of vitamin D, because it does all these things because it's an epigenetic moderator, because it allows you access to your own DNA.
That's so cool.
Aging is related to this. And I find this really fascinating because if every one of these things is linked into vitamin D, and we get vitamin D from being in the sun, it makes us solar powered animals. It really does. We need sunlight for health, period. And again, you don't need to go out and burn yourself and spend too much time in the sun. You definitely want to follow up. I've got a lot of great information on YouTube about how to expose yourself to sun in a healthy way. So, don't hurt yourself. Yeah. But this is related to aging. A lot of different information on something called all-cause mortality is that every cause, the higher vitamin D level, the more time you spend in the sun, the lower your chances of dying is, which is really incredible. And, we're going the wrong direction. People are getting less and less sun.
Yeah. I'll just throw in this too, because a lot of biohackers or anyone in ancestral health, any of this stuff, people are like, oh yeah, go in the sun. And I used to think, oh yeah, that's great, whatever. It's like, oh yeah, Mark Sisson, I read this, a million years ago, but I didn't really know the deep details and reasons why.
Yeah. Yeah. And no one does. And really, so it's not that widely known, and it's confusing. There's so much to this. So I have my next slide here, which I really like, is basically about hibernation. So when your vitamin D level is low, your body thinks it's winter. This is the main thermostat for your body. And when the D level goes down, we literally shift into what I call human power saving mode. And we're lowering all of our metabolic functions to make it through a long cold, foodless winter. And the first thing that happens when your vitamin D level goes down is your parathyroid hormone goes up. And that makes it very difficult for you to release fat because your body is thinking, boy, there's going to be this long famine, and as much fat as I can put on, that's what I need to do, because your gut bacteria shifts and fungus take over, and they send a signal to the brain via the gut-brain axis. And that signal says, eat sugar, eat carbs, eat as much as you can. And then we go out, and everywhere we go, every restaurant, every store, it's all processed carbs. So it's really the perfect storm for obesity. This is people being stuck in permanent winter. They literally, their body thinks that, they're trying to pack on weight. And then when they starve themselves, they basically will break down muscle before they'll burn up that precious fat because they don't have the cellular machinery to access that fat. And that brings us back to a ketogenic diet and being metabolically flexible. Being able to burn fat, you have to have the right molecular machinery to be able to put fat into the electron transport chain and burn it. Your body's going to send this urgent craving. You got to go to get your Starbucks every 3 hours and, eat something because you're getting a signal that you're going to die if you don't eat. And that signal was an evolutionary advantage to our ancestors. That kept us alive.
This is great. So some people know this concept too. Like Dr. Ted Naiman talks about this, and the guy C.N. Foley wrote a whole book about don't eat for winter. And so you have this concept of, humans, the only time we had access to a lot of carbs and, like sugary fruits and stuff that were around was in preparation for winters. And then we wanted to fatten up. And then we had this time of dark and cold, and it's a different mode. I mean, constant winter. That's the kind of takeaway message, is that your message too is we're in the modern day where we're constantly preparing for winter. It's like it's always high carbon, high fat. We're always overeating. We're always in this mode. We're always in the low vitamin D mode.
Yeah, this is the big epidemic. This is terrible. And this is the reason why, if you've been trying to lose weight and you've been doing everything right and you're not losing weight, if you don't know your D level, that's a big issue. You won't be able to really effectively get fit if your D level isn't up well over 40.
So what's next?
So I have some information on epigenetics, and I think we covered a lot of that. And what I kind of want to say is that, just to refresh people's minds or put this in a different way. So every single cell in your body has a copy of your DNA. It's all yours. Half is from your mother, half is from your father. And every different cell type will access different parts of that DNA. Your colonocytes, the cells that line your colon, they're going to access very different stretches of that DNA than, say, a lung cell or a skin cell. So every cell has a highly specialized function, and it's required to go to that DNA over and over again, open the DNA, and copy that information to produce whatever chemicals that we need. And so I have a slide here that shows your DNA and a library. And this is your body's library, your blueprint to make every single chemical that we need. Now, on that note, our gut bacteria, our microbiome, their DNA outnumbers ours 100-1. So if you think about it this way, your DNA is very important, but your microbes' DNA outnumbers yours substantially. So that microbiome is much more important than anyone is thinking about. I have a slide here that says dose response mechanism. And what that means is that the lower the D level, the harder it is to access your DNA. If you don't have access to your own DNA, think about the chemicals that you can't make. And I've already told you that, the enzymes that you can make, some of them repair our DNA. So these enzymes are critical to make. You don't want to limit your body's access to your own blueprint. And this, this is really critical stuff. In a perfect example, there's an enzyme called endothelial nitric oxide synthase, or ENOS. And, this is one of my cartoon characters from my book. This is a really critical enzyme because it regulates your blood pressure and your ability to prevent cancer. And you can't make that enzyme if your D level is too low, just like any enzyme. People, so I say we're solar powered and we're powered by sunshine. And of course, everyone's thinking, well, cancer. I don't want cancer. I had an uncle who had melanoma, so I don't go in the sun. It's one of the most dangerous things you can do. And I feel terrible for all the people who have either had melanoma or more likely had a mole removed that they thought was melanoma, who avoid the sun. This is dangerous, basically. Melanoma is a cancer caused by too little sun, not too much. If melanoma were caused by sun exposure, we'd get it on our nose and on our ears and on our head, and we don't get that. We get it in other places. Those cancers, those are a less dangerous cancer. Squamous cell carcinoma and basal cell carcinoma, those are cancers of the skin, and those are absolutely caused by too much sun exposure, and not enough vitamin D. Humans were designed to live in the sun. It's just that humans lived in the areas where their ancestors evolved, and their skin tone would match that latitude's UV radiation. So if you look at a map, we've got some maps here coming up next, is that you can see where we came from. And there's a map that I have of melanin, which is your skin tone, compared to the UVB radiation. And it's a perfect match. The higher the UVB radiation, the darker the skin. And as you go further north and south away from the equator, skin tone lightens because that melanin protects damage from the sun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is something that I didn't understand until, 7 years ago, why there's different skin colors. Is as we moved away and we moved up north, we needed to have lighter skin. We were selected to have lighter skin because there was less sun. So we needed to have less melanin.
That's right. Well, and you can think of it this way. So if you were a darker skinned woman and you were able to get pregnant and you were in the northern hemisphere, you may not have enough vitamin D to have a healthy child. The child would die, and only the lighter skinned children would survive. That's how powerful of a driver vitamin D and sun exposure is. So, you can just look at a map of Europe and look, from North Africa further north, and you can see the different skin tones. This is a match with the UVB radiation in those areas. And so it makes perfect sense. Lighter skin produces vitamin D much more quickly, and darker skin doesn't. And we have issues when groups of North Africans move to Canada and there isn't as much sunlight, they get sick. They have a much higher incidence in autism. And, autism isn't caused exclusively by vitamin D deficiency, but it's a very high correlation.
Yeah, there's a study that shows that correlation, right?
Yeah. Autism is a very complex topic. I've got a lot of information on that. But, Dr. John Cannell of the Vitamin D Council, which is a great resource if you want some information on vitamin D. He's on one of my previous podcasts talking about autism and vitamin D. It's some pretty interesting stuff and kind of shocking that, again, more doctors don't know this, especially since it's so related to health. So, okay, as we continue on, I want to sort of go back in time here. And talk about heliotherapy. I don't know if people have heard of that. Helios was the Greek god of sun. And basically, he prescribed heliotherapy for both mental and physical health. And this was well known. Athletes trained outside to get sunlight. There's a lot of different historical information on sunlight, and, including the thickness of skulls between Persians and Egyptians. And the Persians wore helmets and didn't get sunlight, and Egyptians shaved their head and, were shirtless. When they went to battle, apparently, an Egyptian could crush the skull of a Persian because they had much thinner bones, because they had much lower levels of vitamin D. So this has been a profound driver in history. And, where people start to remember about this is in the Industrial Revolution. And, we're talking about 1760 in Northern Ireland, England. The Industrial Revolution with coal fires blotted out the sun, and children came down with a new syndrome that was called rickets. And it was a terrible deformation of the bones. And it goes back to, if you're a pregnant woman and you don't have enough vitamin D, your pelvis will deform and you may not even be able to deliver a child. So rickets was the first time in history that we identified that there was a substance that was made from sunlight that could prevent bone anomalies. And when they discovered this, they discovered vitamin D2. And they found that this was the version that nocturnal animals use. This is a different version now. It works on humans, but it's not as specific for the vitamin D receptor. So doctors who prescribe vitamin D2, it will work. It doesn't do a lot of the things that vitamin D3 does. This was something that happened, quite a long time ago. And the next slide shows Wuhan, China. And it shows the air quality of where this epidemic's coming from. And we're really undergoing, I have the slide as the new revolution of 2020. Back in the day, the pollution was really bad in the Western world. But now, China has such a huge population and they have very poor control of their air quality. And this dark pollution blots out the sun, literally. So it's not surprising that this came out of China.
Well, it came out of China for a specific reason, but it could have propagated, or people can do worse because of Yeah.
Right. Well, and especially in the winter season, it would come out more quickly. But I go to my next slide here about tuberculosis. So people have heard about TB or tuberculosis. Brian, what have you heard about tuberculosis? What are your thoughts? Is it something that's on your radar? Do you know anything about it? Because this is something we hear about.
But, yeah, not really. I mean, it's not anymore. But I remember reading about it in Weston Price, and nutrition and physical degeneration. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Well, so people have heard about TB or tuberculosis from pharmaceutical ads where it says, tell your doctor if you have tuberculosis. Tell your doctor if you are prone to infections. Now, first of all, I prefer if my doctor tells me if I have any of those diseases. But the reason they talk about this is that back in the day, tuberculosis was called consumption. It's a bacterial skin and lung infection. And this was one of the most severe diseases facing mankind, prior to the introduction of antibiotics. And you can see this slide of a tuberculosis sanatorium. Now, back before antibiotics, the cure to tuberculosis was to lie in the sun. And you'll see pictures of people lying in hospital beds out in the sun. And, this is kind of laughable because, today doctors want you to stay out of the sun. So prior to antibiotics, that was the cure to bacterial infections. And so think about this. Those medications you see on TV, the reason they talk about infections and tuberculosis is that all of those medications, they will reduce your immune function. So those will all lower your immune system. And those are also some of the people who are being affected by this. If you've been taking some of those medications, and I don't want to name any names, I don't want to get in trouble, but if you're taking these medications for autoimmune disease like I did, you don't know this, but it will actually sequester vitamin D. So those medications will lower your own vitamin D. And these diseases happen to people who already have low vitamin D. So these warnings are all basically talking about the immune restriction of these medications. This is just not widely known. So if you take any of those medications, they're immunosuppressive, you need to it's extremely important to supplement your vitamin D. You need to really watch those levels. And there's one medication that I took as a kid called prednisone that lowers your vitamin D level. So if you're taking prednisone, you must supplement vitamin D. But, this is interesting stuff because back in the old days, there were no antibiotics widely used until the early 1940s. Mm-hmm. The next slide is a picture of Schlitz beer. It was a sunshine beer. So we knew this. We've already gone through this cycle in the 1920s and 30s. This was known. And you can literally get at the sunshine beer. There's advertisements that says, keep sunny summer energy, drink Schlitz all winter long. And this ad is from 1937. This is not new information. It's just that it's been erased from our knowledge. Most young people today, they're very fearful of the sun. They burn quickly, and they're being told constantly, avoid the sun. It's dangerous. And this is bad advice.
What's interesting is that it has come around a little bit during this COVID thing, is that I saw articles circulating about, I think it may have been 1918, where they put people out in the sun to treat them.
Well, it's interesting because it's the Spanish flu. And what they actually found, this was an observation. So they were treating people, I think, World War I, or Spanish flu, but they had so many sick people. I guess they just doing what we did, getting ready to put them outside. And they found that the people who were out in the open air did much better. And of course, there's a component of having fresh air, not being closed in. But a lot of those people were spending time out in the sun. And, I've got a link to that story as well, the 1918 flu and sun exposure. Mm-hmm. Moving on, nothing much changed until a gentleman by the name of Dr. Michael Hollick, and I did a great podcast with him, and you can really hear about how he discovered vitamin D and what made him get into this. He discovered the vitamin D hormone, and he's still in the scene, and he's a really interesting character. And I remember seeing him on TV, it had to be at least 10, 15 years ago, and he was getting in big trouble because he was advocating safe sun exposure, and they had him pitted against a dermatologist who was shaking their finger saying, no sun exposure. And I didn't even know what vitamin D was at that time, but it's very interesting. So he's sort of the father of vitamin D. And he's got a lot of information out there. And he was helpful to bring forward the science. And, he's still really involved in this.
That's great. I'll also throw this in that my family has a huge problem with skin cancer. They all grew up in Hawaii and were sun tanning way too much and getting burned. Yeah, my dermatologist told me to never go in the sun. And now once I learned all this, even as a person who is very, high at risk and it runs in my family, you could say, I am still going out and getting responsible sun every day. So
Yeah, you should. There's much more to it. And then, we can get into the other things that you can do to protect yourself from sunlight, but having that higher vitamin D level is protective. When you go in the sun and the sun damages you, then your body's going to repair that damage, but it can't repair the damage if you block all of the vitamin D, because you won't make those enzymes that are designed to repair the damage of the sun. So where this really comes into play is if you are spending time in the sun and wearing sunscreen, I think it's really dangerous because you've totally blocked your body's ability to warn you to get out of the sun. You've totally dysregulated the balance system that Mother Nature created. But again, there's more to it. We're missing some chemical elements, especially sulfur. Sulfur has been completely eliminated from our food chain, and sulfur and sunlight combine to protect you. And we can talk a little bit about what cholesterol sulfate is and how it creates a reflective mesh barrier on your skin. And there's a lot of good science to support this. And it's a little more detailed. Maybe we can leave it till later. But just know that if you go in the sun, there's a few other components. You should not go in the sun if you don't know your vitamin D level. Having a higher D level and going in the sun will be protective, because you don't want to go and burn yourself until you finally build up the right D level to make those enzymes. You want to go and biohack yourself and raise your vitamin D level up to 40 or higher and then go in the sun. Because at that point, even if you were to wear sunscreen, you would still be in a much safer position. If you did, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So going in the sun with a high D level is much more protective than not knowing your level and going in the sun hoping that you're going to raise your level. So I do recommend that people supplement first and then get sunlight. Okay, so we'll go back on to, I have a very complex slide, and I wanted to put this in here because when people hear that snoring and sleep and all this is related to vitamin D, they start to, get suspicious. Oh, how can this cause everything? So there's a really detailed slide, and this is from one of my gurus, Dr. Stasha Gomanak, and she is a neurologist who made a very simple discovery in this whole paradigm. And that is, one of the enzymes that we don't make when we don't have enough vitamin D is called choline acetyltransferase. This is an enzyme that makes acetylcholine, and acetylcholine is the primary neurotransmitter of the autonomic nervous system, or one of them, and acetylcholine regulates the parasympathetic nervous system. And if you don't have enough acetylcholine, you're going to be stuck in a sympathetic state. And what that means is that you're stuck in fight or flight and you can't get into rest and digest. And that's where this not being able to shut down your racing thoughts comes from. Your body is stuck in fight or flight and you cannot rest and digest. And that's really where it comes into the picture of sleep. There's a second component, and that is the actual raw material for making acetylcholine, and that is vitamin B5, pantothenic acid, and that should be coming from our gut microbiome. So Dr. Gobanak's work is fascinating. I just recently did an updated 5-year podcast with her, and she's really refined her message on how people need to understand how sleep and vitamin D and the gut microbiome are connected. So I have a slide here just to, for anybody who's doubtful, it's literally showing the gap between two neurons and how acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that needs to go across to carry the nerve impulses. And, when you don't have enough acetylcholine, you basically have a short circuit, and the signals that your brain is supposed to be sending to your body, they get garbled. And that's where the snoring comes into this. You can no longer control the musculature of the airway if you don't have enough of the right neurotransmitters. So I've got a slide of Dr. Gomanak and some information on how to contact her. And then we go on to Ivor Cummings. So we've got that posted, and what a great amount of information. And I love his presentation because he's an engineer. This is cut and dry to him. He hasn't been duped by a medical education that hid vitamin D from his understanding, like most doctors.
Yeah.
So that sort of runs through a lot of the history. I have some other slides here about melanoma, how melanoma is increasing over time. And there's a lot of reasons for that as well, but definitely sun avoidance is one of those things. And then, I get into the different levels in that. So maybe this is a good time, Brian, to go back and go further into any of the information that you want.
No, I like this slide. And also, I don't want to be too tied to the slides because most people are going to be listening to this. We can just describe, basically, one of the big things is that the vitamin D ranges that we think are acceptable or what we should be going for are too low, right? Just we think that above 20 is okay. Like some of these, the Food and Nutrition Board or testing laboratories say, above 20, you're fine.
Right.
That's not.
Yeah, this is a good time to talk about vitamin D levels and ranges. And so this particular slide, this is from the Vitamin D Council, and it's available on their website. And the interesting part is we have different organizations who have different ideas of what deficient, insufficient, and sufficient are. Vitamin D Council says one thing, Endocrine Society says another, Food and Nutrition says something different. And so we have to start to think about who we're listening to. And then the scariest part of this is something called testing laboratories. Now, when you get a vitamin D test, like any test, you get a little report that shows you the range. Now, for a lot of laboratories, the normal range used to be 30 to 100. That's 30 nanograms per milliliter to 100. That was the range. And it's quite a large range, but that was considered normal. Recently, over the last 2 years, UCLA, the medical group across the street from me, on their lab test, they changed it and they say that now 20 to 50 is normal and anything over 50 is toxic. I can't believe that they would do this. There's no peer-reviewed studies that support that data because, in fact, just some figures to throw out there, the highest level of vitamin D ever recorded in a human was a level of 100, and that was by a farmer in Puerto Rico who presumably didn't wear a shirt or sunscreen. And that's a level where most people will max out at. That's a level where I think there was a study of lifeguards in Israel would get up to that level. And that's a level that I've attained naturally myself. I've gotten to 99. And that's not from really suntanning. That's just from good exposure. So Mother Nature tops off at about 100. And what happens after that? Well, you break down extra vitamin D. And when you break down that vitamin D, it gets turned into something called lumestrol, which is actually a sunscreen. And Mother Nature, she's never going to let you go too high. But if you take supplements, you can absolutely go too high. And that's why we want to monitor. If you get all of your vitamin D from sunlight, you're never going to be higher than you need to be. But these figures are really important because they're always under dispute. And we need to think about who's doing the study and what does it mean. And it's not that doctors want people to not be healthy. This is an area of information they don't know about. So if you ask a doctor, specific questions about testing, they're going to look at their lab report. And if the doctor's lab report says 20 to 50, they're going to tell you that anything over 50 is toxic. I've had my own patients come to me, my sleep apnea patients come to me and say, hey, I know you like a level of 60 to 80. And by the way, that's my preferred level. 60 to 80 nanograms equates to 150 to 200 nanomoles. That's the ideal range that most of the people who are listening to this have heard from, all the different sources that we really like to pay attention to. So the issue is that these people are trusting their doctors, and to be told that 50 is toxic, this is silly. Disinformation is dangerous to people. So don't worry. And the other thing is, if you go get a vitamin D test and you're very high, don't let your doctor freak you out or panic you. If you can find a single study where someone has died from excessive vitamin D, I'd love you to send it to me because they don't exist. Even levels that are very, very high, all the examples of where people have gone way too high, those people all recovered. They got nauseous and sick, and it was always through an error of labeling or dosing. People were taking massive amounts. So when you get past 100, you're not going to die. I've had patients who've tested 120, 130, 140. You won't notice symptoms until you get way up past 200. There are some studies that show the toxicity comes in past 300, 350. And you have to really be intentionally supplementing a massively wrong dose. But testing is still critical. I don't want anyone to go too high in vitamin D, but if you're taking vitamin K2, don't panic because the calcification is related to the lack of vitamin K2. And again, all those people who went too high, they all survived. All right. So I want to talk, we'll get into the dosing, but let's just still talk about some levels. So these levels are measuring something that's in your body, the 25-OHD level. And it's different than the vitamin D that you actually take in and absorb. So I kind of want to review just real quick the vitamin D biology, just so that people understand what happens. So when you take a supplement or you go in the sun, either way, the chemical that's made is called cholecalciferol. Okay. That is the vitamin D itself. Now this gets absorbed into your body over about an 8-hour period after you're in the sun or when you eat it. And the first thing that has to happen to this is it goes to the liver to be transformed into the storage form, the 25-OHD form that your doctor can measure. A specific amount of that vitamin D, the 25-OHD, will now go to the kidneys where it will be activated into the 125 form, which is very specific, and that's for your absorption of calcium. That's why there's a confusion of the 125 and the 25. So now, and some newer studies have come up that vitamin D itself is protective in your endothelial cells. A new study was posted, and we can link that to this podcast, that vitamin D, the molecule itself, decreased the leakage of endothelial cells. Endothelial cells are the cells that line your blood vessels. So as more and more research gets put into this, we're going to learn more and more and more about what this molecule or hormone does in our bodies. It's pretty fascinating. So those levels are all the 25-OHD level. And again, in Canada and in Western Europe, it's different than in the US. So it can be very confusing, especially when you start to look at levels like 20 and 30. So please, pay attention to whether it's nanograms or nanomoles. There is no one-time toxic dose for vitamin D, realistically. What I like to recommend, are you ready to get into dosing and how much?
Do a little bit. I mean, people can figure that out with their doctor, or we can't exactly give medical advice here.
Yeah, so I'm not giving medical advice, but what I want people to know is that you should always check with your doctor, but just be aware that the majority of doctors think that 1,000 or 2,000 IU is healthy. And keep in mind, the Institute of Medicine has stated clearly that 4,000 IU, international units, is the maximum toxic dose of vitamin D. This number is wrong. Okay, it's off by quite a bit. They're very fearful. So even though you should trust your doctor, just keep in mind that your doctor may not know this. And we can't just blindly trust doctors. I'm a doctor. I didn't know. Mm-hmm. My doctors around here, they don't even agree with me. The question is, if they say stay out of the sun and they don't want you to take more than 4,000 IU of vitamin D, then what are we supposed to do? And I've had patients literally who can't raise their vitamin D level because they're taking 2,000 and 4,000. They can't get their level up. They need 15 and 20,000 IU. Now, it sounds like a massive amount, but I want people to understand that 40,000 IU is 1 milligram. And what that means is that 20,000 IU is 0.5 milligram. So these are numbers that shouldn't make sense to the average person. You just need to know that if you were to go in the sun and expose most of your body for about 20 minutes, you could make 20,000 or 25,000 IU. So that amount, it's not a crazy amount. It just sounds like it. So I'm not advocating taking 20,000 IU, but I'm saying that if you did that, it is safe. And if you want to raise your level quickly, I consider that to be sort of a biological dose. If we can make that amount in one day in the sun, I think that if you took that, that would be, that's not toxic. Mm-hmm. You just wouldn't want to take 20,000 every day forevermore, because once your body fills up, you need to lower the amount of vitamin D that you're taking in. And if you are getting sun exposure and taking supplements, this is where it gets really confusing. So just rule of thumb, if you're taking 5,000 IU of vitamin D and it's cloudy and you haven't been out in a while, that's great. But if it's sunny and you're getting sun exposure every day without sunscreen, you need to stop taking that 5,000 IU. You're going to overdose yourself. Mm-hmm. So this is a much more complex thing than people are thinking about, and it's really important to manage. Mm-hmm. So I have some studies that are linked here, and I just sort of want to read them. Evaluation of vitamin D3 intakes up to 15,000 international units a day and up to 300 nanomoles on calcium is safe. Okay, so there's some studies. I have the links here. They're just showing that higher doses are safe. 15,000 is safe. And again, I'm not recommending that dose, but just don't panic when you hear that. Mm-hmm. 10,000. When I first started telling my patients to take 10,000 IU, they're under my supervision, so I can do that. They would literally be, they'd say, "Oh my God, are you trying to kill me?" And I'd say, "Well, that's 0.25 milligrams." And they'd say, "Oh, okay, that's not so bad." Mm-hmm. So this is, it's confusing. This is a communication issue.
All right. Well, cool. This is great. So then why don't you tell people about safe exposure and just how to figure that out?
Sure. So, whenever you expose yourself, like I said, you really want to make sure that you have a higher vitamin D level to begin with, because, you're human, you're not a hunter-gatherer, you haven't had the sun increasing daily as spring comes along. So I like to think about the conditions that allow you to make vitamin D, and I call these things the D determinants. And these are the conditions that will regulate how much vitamin D you make. All right. So the first one, obviously, is your latitude. So we talked about that line north of Los Angeles to Atlanta. So the amount of vitamin D that you make depends on where you are in relation to the equator. That's one of those conditions. Also, your elevation. Now, the higher up you are, the more vitamin D you'll make, because the atmosphere is thinner and more UVB radiation reaches the earth. So people who live at coastal level, California, there's a lot of moisture in the air, and they will not make as much vitamin D as someone who lives in, say, Colorado, where it's much higher elevation and the sky is clear, there's no water vapor. So they will create vitamin D much more quickly based on elevation.
You can get scorched if you go snowboarding, or when I was in Machu Picchu, I got sunburned like crazy.
That's correct. the atmosphere is so much thinner that you're just getting so much more radiation. And, a lot of the times, especially when you do something like that, hunter-gatherers would walk slowly up a mountain and their bodies would adjust to the increase in radiation. If you're on a ski lift or a gondola, you're not really acclimating. So it can be dangerous. That's why, we're used to putting, chapstick on and covering our face when we go up to ski resorts. So elevation is a pretty important determinant. Next is the time of day. In most places, you can make vitamin D between 10 and 3, and that's usually the time your doctor says to stay out of the sun, which is true. That's strong sun, but that's the time. It varies, again, per season, per location, and that's why that D-Minder app is such a great tool, because it lets you know. It tells you exactly vitamin D is available. So the time of day is sort of easy.
Well, also, there's a difference between people going to the beach for 5 hours from 10 to 3 and people doing what I do is I read in the sun for 20 minutes on my front and 20 minutes on my back during that hour. It's very different.
Very, very big difference. And again, I want to warn people that when you spray sunscreen on yourself and go spend all day in the sun, it's not protecting you like you think. This is much more complex. And we haven't gotten into the different types of sunscreen. We can do that if you like, but just be warned that, you have to be careful. Sunscreen is not what people think. All right, so next we have the percentage of skin exposed. So many people believe that they're getting the vitamin D they need when they go and walk their dog. And that actually brings to light two different issues. They walk their dog at 9 a.m. or at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. They're not getting vitamin D. But more importantly, they're wearing clothing. And all they have exposed is their face and their hands. So the percentage of skin exposed can make a huge difference on how much vitamin D you make if you lie out like you do with your most clothing off, and you'll make more vitamin D. So I like to say, if you're going to go spend some time outside, take off as much clothing as you can legally and expose yourself. And that's going to allow you to create more vitamin D more quickly. The more skin exposed you have, the more vitamin D you'll make. And the next is skin tone. And we talked about darker skin. Melanin is Mother Nature's sunscreen. And the more melanin that you have in your body, the darker your skin is, the longer you need to be in the sun to make the same amount of vitamin D. This is real life. We're watching this in real time. We're watching the people who have darker skin who are suffering these health issues because this information isn't known. So skin tone, very important. Okay. And then the last thing is the cloud cover atmospheric conditions. Probably most people know that they've gotten a sunburn when it's been cloudy. So even though it's not perfectly sunny, that UVB radiation can still make it to you and burn you. So, but keep in mind, if you're going to just expose yourself and you want to do 10, 15, 20 minutes, and I say start slow and start to learn how long you can be in the sun before you start to get a burn. And for safe sun exposure, you're supposed to stay in the sun just long enough for your skin to get a bit pink. And if you have very white skin, that could be 5 minutes. If it's a little dark, it could be 10 or 15. But, take your time, be cautious. And, if it's cloudy, there's no point in going out and lying in the sun. You're just not going to make any vitamin D. It's just not possible. Those are the things that sort of determine, whether you make vitamin D. And we'll go back to, your shadow being shorter than your height. So you can look at a fire hydrant or a street sign. And as the sun casts a shadow, once that shadow is longer than the height of the object you're looking at, you are no longer making vitamin D. And the reason is that the sun isn't high enough in the sky to be strong enough to break that one bond in cholesterol. So that's the easiest way. If you don't have the app, just look at anything around you. If the shadow is longer than whatever the object is, you're done. You're not making vitamin D. Now, just because you're not making vitamin D doesn't mean you shouldn't be in the sun. There's a lot of health benefits from infrared radiation, which is what you see later in the day and earlier in the day. And, that's well known by a lot of the people listening to this. And that's why infrared saunas and red light exposure is healthy, because that component of sunlight is very healing for a lot of very specific reasons. The next thing I sort of want to talk about is the D excuses. And this is important to me just because, as a clinician, as a doctor that treats patients, I talk to each and every one of my patients, and a lot of them sometimes are dismissive. And these are some of the excuses, and we've covered a lot of this. I just had a ton of blood work and it all came back normal. Know this, that vitamin D testing is not in a regular blood panel, which is actually shocking. Its relation to cancer has been verified so many times. This should be on your doctor's radar. They should be testing it at least once a year. I would say twice a year would make sense to me, especially if you're supplementing. You want to know this, okay? Some of the best doctors out there still don't know this, and you need to look through your blood test specifically for the 25 OHD level and find out what it was. Now, keep in mind that if it's 2, 3, 4 weeks or even months old, that level is no longer relevant. The season has changed. You may have been outside more or less. You may be supplementing. So that level is just a picture in time of what your level is. We covered, I walk my dog twice a day, so I get a lot of sunshine. Keep in mind, you got to have your body exposed to be getting that vitamin D, and simply being outside in clothing isn't really a value. All right, so people will tell me they drink milk or juice and it's in there, or a multivitamin. It's a very small amount. There's 100 international units of vitamin D in juice and milk. It's a tiny amount, and it's vitamin D2. It's not even vitamin D3. So if you think you're getting your vitamin D from milk, you're wrong. And juice, same thing. So be aware. Just the amount that's in those two things, milk and juice, is enough to prevent rickets. Now, this is a really good one. My vitamin D was low, but my doctor fixed it. This is terrifying because I see this all the time. My patients will literally tell me this. And what that means is that when people find out they have a vitamin D deficiency, the typical traditional allopathic doctor will prescribe 50,000 international units of vitamin D2. And you'll take that for 2, 4, 6 weeks, and then they're done. They believe they've fixed your vitamin D. They often won't test it again to see that it's come up. They won't give real dosing recommendations because they don't know. And then people believe that they're fixed. It's safe. Their level is fine. And just keep in mind that unless you're actively monitoring this is not a cure. Vitamin D prescription, D2, is not stronger than vitamin D3 that you can buy at the grocery store. A lot of people believe that a prescription should be stronger. It's just not the case. And then we just discussed I eat a really healthy diet. Even if you eat a lot of fatty fish, you really need to do more. You don't have to take vitamin D supplements. In fact, I don't take any supplements for almost the entire year. But, even here in LA, I think, Brian, we talked about this, is that you were getting some sun exposure and your level still wasn't very high. We weren't really getting a lot of sun day after day. And, it was cloudy and it was winter. So there's a lot of things we have to think about. But if I don't have to take a supplement, I don't want to. If I can get something naturally. But, because of people's fear of the sun, it makes perfect sense to be able to do a little combination of a little sun exposure and some supplementation. Yeah, you will not get vitamin D from your diet. It doesn't happen.
Yeah. And just know it's okay. Maybe I'm against supplements too, but if it's cloudy and if it's winter, I guess I'm going to start now that I got my tested and
Right. Okay. If you're going to take vitamin D, even if you're not, I highly recommend supplementation of vitamin K2. It's not just for vitamin D. Vitamin K2 is a cofactor that activates, it was 17 known enzymes at the time when I did my research. It's probably more now. So this is a really critical chemical substance in your body. You always want to take K2 every day. And then magnesium. I know a lot of people figured this out, and a lot of my patients, they're already taking magnesium, which is great. And you want to make sure you're taking all three of those together because they're synergistic. You need magnesium to help with the whole process of absorbing vitamin D and creating energy and all this stuff. So those are I call them the terrific trio. That's the minimum that someone should be taking or thinking about. And I like to also add sulfur. I like organic sulfur called MSM. I think it's really important for a lot of different reasons, and in the production of cholesterol sulfate. If you're going to go in the sun, you want to know that you have the right amount of sulfur in your body, and sulfur is deficient. There's a lot of reasons. One of them is because of the pesticide glyphosate. This lowers your ability to absorb sulfur. And, this is a really great topic, cholesterol sulfate and sun exposure, that we can talk about another time. I don't want to confuse people. But if you're going to go spend time in the sun, you probably really want to do some supplementation of sulfur. You can eat foods that are very rich in sulfur. And those are oysters and seafood. And so if you have that ancestral diet, you probably are absorbing a decent amount of sulfur. The real issue is that the sulfur we used to have in our bodies was brought in through the microbes that would fix it into the plants that we would eat. And so places where they use these pesticides, the microbiome of the soil is being destroyed, and the enzymes and the microbes that fix this organic sulfur and make it into the active form sulfate, they're not doing this anymore. So that's why we need to be really concerned about that. If you're going to go in the sun, know that Mother Nature has a backup system besides melanin, and that's cholesterol sulfate and filigrein. And this is a protein system that is created by sun exposure if you have enough sulfur. And here's another scary component to that is sunscreen itself has aluminum destroys the enzyme enos, endothelial nitric oxide synthase, that makes this protective substance. So putting on sunscreen, not only does it not protect you, but some of the sunscreens destroy your body's ability to make the sun protective chemicals. It's really interesting stuff. This is pretty scary. So if you're going to get your stuff naturally, which I really prefer, I don't want to take some. I don't want to be doing all that, but we have to make some accommodations because we live in the modern world.
Yeah. And talk about glyphosate for a quick second, because it's a whole podcast on its own, and maybe I'll have some expert on at some point. But what are the big problems there?
Okay, so an overview is that glyphosate is used in a lot of pesticides. This will interrupt the enzymes. There's enzymes called the cytochrome 450 superfamily. I love that name. It's all these different enzymes that are related. But specifically in your liver, those enzymes to take vitamin D itself and activate it into the 25-OHD storage form, those CYP enzymes, they are interrupted with glyphosate. There's a lot of controversy because, it was Monsanto, now Bayer, whoever the powers that be, they don't like a lot of this information getting out there because they say that this glyphosate is not harmful to humans. And they're kind of right in some ways, but it's completely toxic to our microbes. Your microbiome is being destroyed by this stuff, and it's everywhere. If you're not eating organic food, you're eating carbohydrates, wheat and corn and soy, this stuff is loaded with it. So this chemical gets into your body, and where it interrupts this with regards to vitamin D, and I think this is a big component to a lot of the vitamin D deficiencies of people who are going outside, is that now you have this vitamin D in your body, and the enzymes that are supposed to make it active into the form that can help you, those enzymes are being destroyed by glyphosate. And the chemistry is very simple because everyone wants to have these RCT studies. They want to have these specific studies done to show that something causes something or something affects something. But if we look at mechanism of action, where this comes into place is that we have amino acids, and all of our proteins and enzymes are made of amino acids. All of our muscles and tissue are made of protein. So the amino acid glycine is almost a perfect match for glyphosate. And when it comes to how these amino acids are incorporated into your proteins, this changes how these proteins start to fold. And enzymes are nothing other than long strings of protein that get folded up into a specific three-dimensional shape. And having that extra piece, that's the difference between glycine and glyphosate, and you can Google the chemical structure, they're very similar. This little extra bit that is glyphosate starts to interrupt with the normal folding pattern of enzymes. And when it comes to health, this is at the core of everyone's health. This is related to why infrared saunas work. If your proteins don't fold properly, they can't function properly, either structurally, in collagen, or in enzymes and proteins that do different things. This is a whole different discussion about protein foldings and autophagy and that type of stuff. But where this glyphosate comes in is that this stuff is everywhere, and it's an insidious, slow poisoning. If there's enough of this stuff, it will get substituted for glycine. And this is really kind of terrifying. So how it relates to vitamin D, these enzymes, these CYP enzymes, they are having a hard time converting that vitamin D into the 25-OHD form. And those are the same enzymes that get the active form. So it's the same group of enzymes. They basically, technically they hydroxylate. So they change this molecule once to make it the storage form. And then when you need it, you need to upregulate, you need to switch that enzyme into the active form. The enzymes that do that, the CYP enzymes, they are being affected by this. So they're literally preventing us from creating the active form of vitamin D as well, which is terrifying.
Wow. I think the most interesting takeaway is the technicality that maybe it doesn't affect humans directly, but the glyphosate affects the gut microbiome. Yeah. It's a good way. It's kind of like the smoke screen type of thing where why people, they haven't had, well, there are some lawsuits actually.
Yeah, there was one recently, but I don't think, the thing is that glyphosate does so many bad things, causing cancer, absolutely, but I don't know that was necessarily the right way to go. I interviewed Stephanie Seneff, and I love her. We've had a couple of interviews with her, and I have some on my YouTube channel. She talks a lot about the regulatory issues, but it's the truth is that this is toxic to our bacteria, and this is really interesting. So that bees we're really in trouble. We're losing all our bees. Mm-hmm. There are studies that show, one of the root causes of the destruction of our bees, aside from radiation, is that the gut bacteria of bees and glyphosate. So this stuff, it interferes with a set of enzymes called the shikimate pathway. And I have cartoon characters to represent the 7 shikimate enzymes. And these are the enzymes that produce serotonin, dopamine, melatonin. And a real simple equation is that melatonin is your anti-cancer hormone. If you are interrupting the production of melatonin, cancer is going to increase. So actual bees themselves are being affected by glyphosate. And the reason they're being affected is that it's destroying their gut microbiome. That's why we're seeing less bees. And so, we don't even need human trials to explain this. This is the same set of enzymes that do this. Humans and the animal kingdom are so intimately connected that we have to look at these things and say, well, look, it's killing the soil microbiome. It's killing other animals' microbiome. Do you think it's not killing our microbiome?
Yeah. I don't think anyone is for glyphosate, but some people are, more skeptical than others. So
Brian, I have to be honest with you. I didn't get into what I'm doing to be an environmental crusader. But as I followed the science, this stuff kept presenting. Every time I'd start to look at this, I'd be like, oh, there's glyphosate again. There's glyphosate again. I don't care about glyphosate. I don't want to know about this. I buy organic and I eat high-fat, grass-fed organic. I try and avoid all that stuff, but we can almost not get away from this. I recently did a great interview with a guy who forced the Canadian government to test foods. His name is Tony Mitra. And boy, when you see what's in foods, this has been going on in Canada for a long time, but this stuff is in all processed carbohydrates. If wheat, corn, soy is involved, that stuff's in there. And it brings us to, a different discussion on the biofuels. When we make biofuels, we're using these seed oils. And this glyphosate is getting put into everything and potentially being aerosolized when we burn these fuels. Again, a whole different discussion.
That's another reason to not eat corn, wheat, and soy. So
right. Yeah, if you didn't have enough reasons, and it's really tragic because as we move forward with this plant-based nonsense, the wrong side is taking up the cause. The big food and big pharma is taking up the vegan cause, and they're tying these save the planet, go vegan. And, these foods are really toxic because of this basically glyphosate. This is a massive issue. It affects us so profoundly, but it's insidious because you can't see it. It's not obvious.
Yeah. Well, a lot of this stuff is not obvious because people can eat, they say, oh, well, I eat Pop-Tarts and I'm fine. And then, 30 years later, they're have.
Well, that's the thing too. It's, do you know if the choices that you're making on a daily basis are going to help you in the future? So 30 years ago, we were told, stay out of the sun and don't eat fat. And you have done a massive amount of good to that cause. But if you think about it, just think about what our bodies are and where we came from. Humans evolved to be hunter-gatherers. So when we think about ancestral anything, of course, we need to look back to what we used to do on this planet before modern civilization. These companies that are pushing this stuff, they don't care about you. They want to make money. They haven't sworn an oath to do no harm. They're out there to say, hey, we have these whole grains. And now, I don't know if you saw this, but a lot of them are saying this non-GMO. Just because something's non-GMO doesn't mean it doesn't have glyphosate. They are spraying glyphosate on all kinds of crops to desiccate it. And that means to kill it so they can harvest it faster. So just because something is non-GMO doesn't mean it doesn't have glyphosate. You really need to look for certified organic. It's really important. And the whole grass-fed thing. Think about this. If the animals that are eating this toxic stuff, and they are corn and grain, the animals are eating this, it's in them as well. So when you eat an animal that is eating these GMO crops from big food, these animals are also becoming infected with this stuff. Our food chain is being completely polluted, and the soil and water and everything, this stuff, it's not being tested. The powers that be are so powerful, they don't really allow industries that want to bring this forward because they get shut down. Tony Mitra warned me that I could lose my license, and he's probably right. Because these are powerful corporations that have an unlimited amount of money and they fight dirty. We really need to be careful. Our health is being subverted for profit. It's just hard to get the message out.
Yeah, that's huge. Well, I have nose to tail.
We went off here a bit, but that's how I wasn't concerned about glyphosate, but it actually interferes with the production and activation of vitamin D. These are the enzymes that you're relying on to keep you healthy. If vitamin D regulates aging and the enzymes that activate vitamin D are getting broken because of glyphosate, we have a much bigger problem than people are understanding.
Yeah.
So I hope it didn't cloud the issues too much. Don't worry about it, that type of stuff. But obviously, we wanted to progress the paradigm of ancestral eating, high-fat, grass-fed organic products.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Nose to tail. I got to plug that real quick. I'm on board with it.
Absolutely.
So let's wrap this back up. We have the whole COVID thing that's on everyone's mind. We have the study by Grassroots Health. They even looked at the different skin colors and nationalities based on the cases.
Yeah, they've got a lot of stuff available on their website. And this is a group of doctors who are really passionate about this. And they're really great scientists and people. And I created cartoon characters to share this information because no matter how loud we scream, it's hard to get this information across. But if you go to their site, these guys are the leading edge experts in this, and there's some really great information. You can see some of the statistics. You don't have to believe me, but this is my feeling is that the vitamin D message isn't quite going to break until the fall, where there'll have been enough time for people to understand that, well, whoa, this went down to the southern hemisphere and now it's back up here again. Something interesting to think about.
Cool. Well, I guess we can wrap it up. Oh, maybe I'll play devil's advocate for a quick second. Now, I just realized you talked about whale blubber, and that reminded me, because some people say, oh, well, what about these Inuit or people in the very far north that don't get that much sun if they're eating whale blubber that has tons and tons of vitamin D?
Right. Well, it's even more profound than that because they have darker skin. So that darker skin was fine. People with darker skin can exist, but their diet has to be of that fatty fish. The animals that those people eat or are used to eat, that was the protective component. Because the truth is, when they don't eat that food, they get sick. When I first graduated, I worked up north in Canada, and I worked on Indigenous populations who had basically, this is Weston Price's core story. They had left their ancestral ways, and they were all very sick, eating bleached flour and sugar. So the diet that Indigenous people ate or eat is highly protective. So, when it comes to skin color, if someone has dark skin and they're healthy, they've got to be getting their vitamin D from somewhere. You can't fool Mother Nature. Even if you don't believe the profound nature of most of the information I've given here, just understand this. It doesn't matter what you think or believe. Mother Nature literally is a law of physics. And you can't fool Mother Nature. Your body can't be fooled. If you don't have enough of the chemical, it's going to affect you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then here's my other thing I brought up. My devil's advocate thing is I asked you, so we're talking about the flu season. It's very related to the levels of vitamin D in the sun. Why is there kind of year-round flu season close to the equator when they have so much vitamin D?
Right. That's a really great question. The best example I can give you is I have a friend who lives in Costa Rica. And when I went down to visit him, his children were grinding their teeth very loudly in sleep. And I thought to myself, I said to him, listen, your kids are vitamin D deficient. He said, well, how could that be? This is Costa Rica. And I said, well, tell me about their day. He said, well, they go to school at 9 and they get out at 4. In the tropics, you're done. You're not going to get any vitamin D if you're inside between those hours. And I said, well, why? He said, well, because the doctors are telling us not to go out in the sun during that time. So they keep the kids indoor during their lunch break. And it kind of blew my mind. And, it goes to the same thing. If you live in Africa and you have air conditioning and you don't go outside, we've lost the ability to make judgments based on people's location because their behaviors have changed profoundly. And in a lot of these tropical locations, people are avoiding the sun. If you look at the indigenous populations in those areas, they don't have this issue. They don't have the same illness. The flu doesn't affect them. But that's why it's no longer just your latitude and location. It's literally your exposure because, we're really changing the way humans behave.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because especially when it's the most hot in the most middle of the day. And if people have AC in Africa, they're going to be inside in the AC.
Yeah, we want to be comfortable. Most of the diseases that are happening to us is because humans, we forgot our place in the natural order. And we did all these things that we thought were progress that made our lives more comfortable and easier. But ultimately, we were separating ourselves from our natural habitat. And the result is illness. It's interesting stuff.
Yeah. Well, wrap this up here. So we're not saying you're going to be immune to COVID if you have high vitamin D, but you'll probably be a lot better off. What can we say?
Yeah, you're gonna bolster when you have vitamin D sufficiency, a level up over 40 or up over 50. The way your body is going to handle any infection, COVID or otherwise, is very different. You're going to have much more of the natural immunity that we were designed to have, and you will most likely have a much better outcome. It's not a cure. There is no magic bullet. This is one of the aspects, but it's a really profound aspect. And if you haven't heard this before, you're not alone. This is just not that widely known. And it still isn't today. My local doctors are still fighting me, but you can look up all this stuff. Anyone can be a WebMD. There's lots of stuff that's been written about this. Some of the studies are hard to figure out. And if you see a study that doesn't support vitamin D supplementation, take a look and see if they ever did a blood level. A lot of studies just gave a dose. We gave 1,000 IU for 3 months. No effect. So vitamin D is useless. Not understanding what this is changes even how you design these studies. So it's quite important. Again, be careful. Don't burn yourself. And just know that this is an area of health and well-being that I believe is going to come forward. I want to do a little shameless promotion here. My book is called The Modern Epidemic, and I'm going to be releasing an ebook version that has a summary and some statistics and some instruction, just so that people can see this in writing and have the proper links. It's an interactive document to take you to these different websites that we've mentioned. And I want people to come to my website, modernhuntergatherers.com, or my YouTube channel, Modern Hunter Gatherers, and sign up to get, a pre-release of this. There's no charge. I'm giving this away. I just want people to have the resources to be able to make the right choices for themselves. And so I'll be excited to, hear from everyone. And I'm hoping to launch my book this summer. But in the meantime, I want to get this information out there as widely as possible, because this is really the time where, I want as many people to know that your children can be affected by this. Mercifully, we haven't seen children getting sick with this. So there's definitely more to it than vitamin D, because I think a lot of kids are vitamin D deficient. But this is a major aspect and I really want to help people to understand that this is a confusing topic. You shouldn't know about this, but this is important. I want people to know that if you don't sleep right, you can't age well. If you don't sleep right, you can't avoid major illness. And sunlight, circadian rhythms, sun exposure, and darkness, how our bodies interact with the natural environment is critical for our long-term health. So I think and hope you're going to be hearing a lot more about this on how humans interacting with their natural environment, or at least telling their bodies, giving it the right sensory inputs, can keep you healthy. Super important to think about. I love it. And check them out. Modern Hunter Gatherers. Look them up. Are you on Instagram? It's a different name. If you have questions disorder, sleep apnea, my regular website is Modern American Dentistry. I have a sleep page, and I actively treat sleep apnea, and happy to share my information with anyone. That's great. Thank you so much for coming on, and I'll link to everything in the show notes. And this is great. Let's keep talking about this. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and thanks for all you do. All right. There's another one. I hope everyone is taking this seriously and getting some vitamin D and getting outside and maybe supplementing if they need to, and eating all the good animal foods, getting the vitamin K2 and magnesium as well. Please go to sapien.org to learn about everything we're doing there. And you can link to Food Lies. You can still pre-order that on Indiegogo. You can see the health technology we're building. You can look at nosetotail.org, where we have all the great meat that's shipped straight to you. And you can also support us on Patreon, patreon.com/peakhuman. Thank you so much. Really appreciate everyone. See you next week.